Did you know that legally speaking, only one group of individuals in a non-profit organization cannot make a profit? That seems wrong, but it's just one of the many things which surprised me in talking to our expert today. Welcome to the Just Dumb Enough podcast, a show that acknowledges no one is always an expert by dispelling misconceptions with real experts. I'm your host as always, Colton Petrie. Sorry for the delay in the episode from Monday to Tuesday. My original episode had some major audio problems that require more attention. However, my guest today is Mickey Desai. Mickey is a podcaster and nonprofit expert who has served on several board of directors and now gives advice to those who are working in or entering the nonprofit space. I definitely came away from this one with a whole new view on how NPOs function and the challenges some of them face. Let's do work for free, maybe. Welcome to the show, Mickey Desai.
Hello, Colton. How are you?
I'm doing very well. How are you, sir?
I'm great. I have one question.
Yeah.
Why am I here? I'm kidding.
That is always the question of the day is, right. Even when you're listening to this show, why am I here? What is this? What is happening right now?
What is going on?
Yeah, no, I mean, why don't you kind of introduce yourself a little bit for the audience?
Sure. I do a number of different things in my waking life. I do have a full-time job working IT with the Secretary of State of Georgia. I have a nonprofit consultancy, which is what I originally caught your eye, I believe. And it's called the Nonprofit Snapcast. I sort of still dabble in nonprofits and help them with their leadership and other issues. Along those lines, I have a podcast called the Nonprofit Snapcast. And for fun, I have another podcast called The Thing About Cars. It's just a hobby podcast, and we BS about cars for 30 or 40 minutes at a time. So those are the major highlights there. I'm sure that's way more than you wanted to know.
No, I think that's great. And it's like this show operates as a springboard. So like divert people, if you're a car person, you just found out about a car podcast. If you're interested in this nonprofit, once we get like talking about that nonprofit Snapcast, like that's a great place to go and learn more. So again, like, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate this. What kind of like got you into the nonprofit field?
It's a good question. I was asking myself this question quite a long time ago as I was working as a technical writer, which, as anybody who's done it can tell you, is tends to be a very solitary, very introverted endeavor. And I'm way too much of an extrovert to do that for any length of time. And so as I was going crazy being this technical writer, even though I was seeing some success with it, sitting behind a computer for 8 hours a day without minimal interaction with people was starting to wear on me. And at that point in my life, my friends were like, Mickey, you're gregarious, you're extroverted, you should be in sales. I'm like, I hear you, right? I heard that. And they weren't wrong, but I didn't want to sell a product. I didn't want to sell a company's bottom line. I wanted to do something a little more noble. And in the nonprofit world, development and fundraising is sales. And so that's when I transferred the desire, to get out from behind a computer into I marketed the skill set to be able to work in the nonprofit sector doing something along the lines of fundraising. And that's where it all started. And saw some decent success with that for a while, some highs and some lows, which is just life. And then in 2008, I invented this micro assessment, which I'm in the process of turning into an app. But this micro assessment is designed to take the temperature of a company, specifically a nonprofit company, and gauge their management structures to try to shine a light on what needs improving and what doesn't need improving. And it's meant to shorten discovery phase for consultants by an order of power. So what might take a consultant a week worth of interviews to do, I can shorten that down into the space of 3 hours, maybe 4 hours with this micro assessment. So I'm appifying that even as we speak. And I just love the nonprofit sector. It's full of a bunch of impassioned people who want to do something concrete towards making the world a better place. And it's non-governmental work, right? So they typically don't have the same kind of bureaucratic delays. I was going to say speed bumps, that the rest of the government work tends to do. They tend to be hands-on with their work. They tend to see more immediate return from the work that they do. But on the other hand, the nonprofit world, the way it's legally structured, does leave its own set of challenges. especially within the culture of nonprofit leadership in itself. But I'm not sure I'm answering your question anymore. So
No, it's good. I think it's one of those that people hear like, oh, a nonprofit organization. And, we get like a pretty specific image in our head. What is a nonprofit like at its most basic level?
I have a friend who very wisely says that nonprofit is a tax status, not a business model. And I think there are a lot of people out there who have this preconception that nonprofit is some sort of a pejorative. It's an insult. And why would I trust a nonprofit? Because they're nonprofit. They don't have to make money. They don't make a lot of money. They underpay their people anyway. There's a lot of myth busting that needs to get done around the notion of what a nonprofit is and what a nonprofit isn't. So what a nonprofit is, it's still a business. It still has to make money. It still has to survive and pay its bills. There are, I think, constraints around how nonprofits can make money, but nonprofits can still make a ton of money if they wanted to. There are very, very lucrative nonprofits out there, but as long as they don't report a profit at the end of the year, they're still in the black and everything's good. There are other nonprofits, of course, who struggle for the next dime, and so doing the end of the year reporting for them is a little bit different. But it's not the nonprofit 501c3 designation is a tax status. It is not a business model. And you can get paid quite a bit of money to do a good job in the nonprofit sector, even though, yes, it is true, stereotypically, they don't make as much as their corporate scale. I will say that people who work in the nonprofit sector are in some ways used to doing more with less, whereas the corporate sector tends to have the luxury of being able to throw money at problems to make them go away. The nonprofit sector does not have that luxury. And I think that that gives them sort of an edge over their corporate counterparts, which is why people work in the nonprofit sector as a labor of love. They want to see something happen. They need to see the needle move on a problem, and therefore they get down in it and do it, even if it means they're not making 20% more like their corporate peers are. So it's a tax structure. It's not a business model. The other thing that people don't understand about nonprofits is that you can't own a nonprofit. There's no such thing as ownership of a nonprofit. A corporate structure in the regular for-profit world has an ownership structure. You either own the shares or the majority of them. You share that responsibility with a room full of boards of directors who have ownership stakes in the company or something like that, right? And when a dividend happens, when a surplus happens, you have to share that surplus with the people who own a stake in your company. Anybody who's bought stock knows that. But in a nonprofit sense, there is no dividends. If you happen to be wildly successful at your fundraising job and there's money left over at the end of the year, you don't get to share it with the board. You have to pour that back into the mission activities of the nonprofit. And creative control of the nonprofit itself does not usually live with the executive director, right? So there's an executive director. The executive director's boss is the board of directors. And so if the board wants to shut down your organization, the executive director typically doesn't get a say in that, when it comes down to the vote. If the executive director, who may have been the founder of the organization, the executive director says, oh, this year we're going to, shift our mission-driven activities a little bit, and we're going to feed the homeless using this facility, and it's going to cost X, Y, and Z. And your board of directors, who have fiduciary responsibility of the organization, they may say, that's not feasible. You can't do that. Find another way. Or, no, we can't do a soup kitchen, but we can do a food bank. And if the director has a problem with that, it's too bad. You have to do what your board tells you. And I point that out because a lot of people have come to the table to me to say, Mickey, I've got this great idea for a nonprofit. Here it is, blah, 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 blah. Most well-intentioned people in the world, folks with biggest hearts ever, they want to do something constructive towards changing the world. I understand that. But Mickey, I want to start a nonprofit, blah, 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 blah. My first response is, please do not. Please don't start that nonprofit. My second response is, even if you start that nonprofit, you as a board member cannot make a dime on the nonprofit's actions. You have to be an employee of the organization. So let's pretend you do that. You start the nonprofit. You have a board of directors in place. You are the founder and you set yourself up as that executive director. Sure, you get a paycheck, but you lose fiduciary control of the organization and you lose creative control of the organization. Your board of directors can now decide to fire you. They can decide to restrict your budget. They can decide to take the organization in other creative directions to get a mission goal met. It's in their hands. It's not in your hands anymore. So, but to get back to the original statement of, okay, you want to start a nonprofit, please don't. There are a ton of nonprofits in the world already. And I hate to boil it down to an element of competition, but I think people don't look around before they start developing their business plan towards making a nonprofit. It's a nonprofit still requires a business plan as if it were a for-profit entity. But as they make their nonprofit, they don't do competition analysis that well. And given that the pool of funds available for nonprofits in general tends not to change from year to year, you do add sort of an extra competitive element in there. And I always think it's better to join an existing company that is seeing some traction in their given realm than it is to introduce competition to that company. So if you want to, the example I used in one of my blog pieces is, if your objective is to open a battered women's shelter for abuse victims and help them get their GEDs and provide art therapy, I had a lady tell me that's what she wanted to build. And my first answer was, you realize that within a 10-mile radius of us where we sat and had coffee that day, there were 3 other organizations that did something similar. And why not just join one of them as a board member instead, or as a volunteer, or whatever, and then introduce your ideas slowly into the mix instead of coming straight out of the gate swinging with a business plan and a fundraising agenda that says, I'm going to do things my way. We're going to do art therapy and instead of GED training, So I encourage people to be flexible with our ideas. And if the means of getting someone helped involves a slight change in those ideas, there's nothing wrong with helping someone else who's already in the arena trying to make things better.
It's one of those that's definitely like, what's better, 10 companies that make $100,000 or one company that makes $1 million? And you're like,
Exactly.
well, it depends on what you're doing. If you're trying to help the most amount of people, it's best just to have everything in one area, as opposed to like, well, it's scattered around the county.
Exactly. And I've met, coincidentally, I have met people who volunteer with a number of organizations simultaneously. And being a broad-based volunteer, if all you're doing is going to show up at a soup kitchen and serve soup, and the next day you turn around and you go to the tool bank and you're helping them repair tools, and then the 4th day you go to an animal shelter and you're helping clean out cages, that kind of volunteering, by all means, spread it out, do as much of that as you want. But if you're going to volunteer as a board member service for nonprofits is volunteer service. Like I said, board members are not allowed to make a dime on their volunteer service. But those board members have fiduciary responsibility for the organization. Their signature is where that buck stops. I have met friends who are like, Mickey, I could do 2 or 3 boards at the same time. I'm like, no, you cannot. Your calendar may make room for that, but no, you're not there. And in fact, if you do that, you're hurting all 3 nonprofits, because one nonprofit deserves 100% of you more than 3 nonprofits deserve 33% of you. And that's, I think, significant for people who are looking at that kind of volunteer service. It is great volunteer service to be on a board member. Fantastic way to do networking, fantastic way to steer an organization in some meaningful direction. But it does come with its responsibilities. It does come with its limitations.
Yeah. Well, and there's certainly, as we talked about like myths and misconceptions and stuff in this realm, like I think a lot of people are surprised to hear like, oh yeah, you can work for a nonprofit and make good money. You can also serve on the board of what is essentially a company and not make any money, which is like very counter to kind of how people are used to it, where they're like, oh, I might work for a major company and I don't make hardly anything, but if I was on the board, I'd be a millionaire.
Exactly. That's right. It's a little bit flipped in that regard. And there are other models. There's other, like some states have hybrid models where a company can have this weird hybrid between for-profit and nonprofit governance at the same time. I don't know what the financial backbones of those companies look like yet, because Georgia doesn't do that yet. So I know they exist. I just don't know much about them. But for the traditional nonprofits, the 501c3s that we've talked about, that's exactly right. It's actually unethical, if not illegal, for a board member to make money on the nonprofit's activities. And even down to the case where if your nonprofit needs HVAC help and you own an HVAC company, you have to document things very carefully to make sure that you can sell things to your own nonprofit ethically. You have to make sure that there are multiple bids, that there are no other recourse, that the money is appearing in not only in the nonprofit's books, but in your company's books the same way. It's defending your 501c3 tax status is a serious game.
That sounds very challenging. And it kind of makes me think like, as you're talking about a board can just like seize control from the person who developed this. Couldn't you, in theory, I don't know how well it works practically, but in theory, couldn't you design your nonprofit to be like, well, it's, my 4 friends that had this dream with me, and they are the board members and I am the executive. And so it's like it's all still in-house. It's just very like you got to really trust your friends, I guess.
You have to really trust your friends, and your friends had really better be on the ball with what it means to be a board member. Because again, if that nonprofit fails for some reason, their wallets are on the line, and a individual board member can be sued for the actions of their nonprofit. And Sarbanes-Oxley says even more than that. Not only can a board member be sued, but let's say, for instance, you run a mental health organization and one of your clients commits suicide. Okay, it's bad. Board members are now on the line. They could potentially be sued for the actions of their employees, potentially. But let's say it's financial, or no, I'm sorry, let's use that same example. I just thought of a way to do this. Let's say that you're on that board, God forbid, one of your clients commits suicide, but if there is a credentialed person on that board that should have recognized the problem was about to happen, they're actually more liable than the people on the board who didn't have that knowledge. To paint another aspect of this, let's say your nonprofit has run into some sort of accounting problem and you're now facing bankruptcy. If there's an accountant who's on the board, they should have had their eyes on this the entire time. They are a little bit more liable than their peers that are on the board simply because of their specialized knowledge in accounting. And so I mean, it's not child's play. It's great volunteer service, but you have to know what you're doing, and you have to treat your board service as a job. So if I'm that person and I want to get my friends on the board, those friends better be prepared to work. Yeah. They can't just show up and vote on minutes once a month to be done.
Well, and that really reinforces this, like, you can't give 33% of your attention to three places because, if you're suddenly liable for these things, like, not only have you not made money, you might be out money, for volunteering, which is, I mean, a lot of people do it like, I don't expect anything in return. Like, well, are you expecting to lose stuff in return? Because you might actually lose things.
Right. And there are protections, right? I mean, a good organization had better have directors and officers liability insurance. That does exist to protect your board, and it's cheap. So if your organization's not buying it, stop everything, go buy a policy. But as an individual serving on a board, your own umbrella policy. If you have a house or if you have a car, normally the people who sell you those policies can also sell you what's called a personal liability umbrella. That umbrella also protects you from this sort of danger. So costs a couple $100 a year. Totally think it's worth it if you're going to be on a board. I don't want to scare people into thinking that these suits happen left and right. I had served on boards for the better part of 20 years, never even had hint of a lawsuit in that time. So it's just better to be prepared.
Sure. So let's say we've ignored your advice to not start a nonprofit. We want to get started. Is there like a pretty hefty amount of paperwork to start a nonprofit?
The answer is yes. I think it varies from location to location. And I would simply say that most major metropolitan areas have some sort of resource handy that helps pave the road for you. Like Georgia Center for Nonprofits has some resources on starting your own nonprofit that explains, that you have to file, you have to incorporate, once you get your incorporation, certain things have to fall in place, and then you apply for your tax status. So you could be an incorporated business running in a location and still not have your 501c3. So, check out the laws in your area, check with local experts if they've got to be there. Either lawyers or accountants typically hold that knowledge. Sometimes there's some of the major cities have a candid foundation library, foundation center resources, stuff like that. They have that kind of information. And any good library, for that matter, is going to have good resources. Any good public library should have resources that are full of things like, here's how you start a nonprofit in this state.
So, I mean, as we've related it to like, this is just like any other business, I guess I had this question that's like, well, can it be for literally anything? And you're like, well, yeah, it could be for anything, but is it going to make any money as a business doing that is kind of a whole different question. Yeah.
I mean, if you're forming a business of your own in the for-profit space, part of your analysis should be revenue, have everything to do with revenue. Are you mitigating your risks properly? Are your competitors really a danger? Can you complete, quarter one with money in the bank, or are you going to be in debt? And if you are in debt, are you going to be back in the black by the end of year one or not? Things like that. The for-profit world has to answer some of those same questions. We're not looking at profitability, but we are looking at for most people, just stability and scalability. So can they grow? If they can't, can they at least maintain? Where's that money going to come from? Are there enough donors to support that? Do we need to do an event? Which I think is a terrible thing for nonprofits to think about, by the way. I know the nonprofit world loves their galas. They love their fundraisers. But events are a fantastic way for nonprofits to go broke. And I tell people that in my consulting work. But there are many other things that nonprofits should be looking at in terms of driving that revenue. It's still revenue. And that's what I mean. A nonprofit is still a business. They still have to drive revenue.
It definitely seems like when I think of a nonprofit, I'm like, it's funded based on donations. Like that's the image in my head. And then I see, there's lots of, I'm sure, nonprofit organizations out there like, ASPCA or whoever else. And I'm like, I see 1,000 commercials from them. That's got to cost quite a lot of money to hope that you make the amount of money back. And that to me as a person, like, to say, oh, a gala, like, well, I might have a fun night out and maybe the memory is worth it to me. But if I like donate my money and then I see that my money went into producing a commercial to try and get more money, I'd be pretty upset because I'm like, I haven't actually donated any money to the cause.
And I have told nonprofits, I'll donate, but if you mail me one thing, I'm not going to donate next year. I flat out told them that. I'm like, please do not put me on a mailing list. In fact, I don't even want an email. Just acknowledge my contribution, know that I love you, and that I don't want you to waste your time on me. And some nonprofits are responsive to that and some aren't. But I think also expectations are changing around the world of galas and fundraising. There are still some people who very much love a good party, like you've said. But there are other people who are echoing the other thing that I just said, which is, I'd rather know that my dollar is having a much bigger impact. Please don't spend it on a chocolate fountain,
Yes, certainly. Because it is one of those, like, those costs are up front. They have to come out of your bank before you make any money on this fundraiser. So if you don't hit your mark, like, all you've done is waste money.
That's right. That's right. And that's a big fallacy that nonprofits think because, fundraising events have an immediate return and they're kind of adrenaline drivers because you get to see that people are coming and enjoying a party, but there's nothing there unless you're telling your story effectively. There's nothing there that says to those people who come up to your party that good work is occurring behind the scenes or good hard work is occurring behind the scenes. But like I said, I think the culture's changing. I think people are understanding that the work isn't always caviar and cupcakes.
Well, and I know there's a lot of that, like kind of in the broader donation world where people are like, say, running food banks. And they've openly said, like, the best donation you could give us is cash.
Yeah.
That, like, it's way more useful than, whatever, like having to sift through your expired green bean cans or whatever. They're like, please, like, don't do that. Just give us cash in hand and we will make it work.
Green beans. Yes. Sorry, I was a little distracted there for a minute. Green base. No, but you're right. You're absolutely right. And it's weird. I didn't know that food banks could actually turn around and use that money to more efficiently get food into the hands of people who need it than, like you say, than sifting through boxes of leftovers from canning industries and stuff like that. It's kind of shocking to me. But that's sort of at the core of the work that I do, helping people get used to their leadership roles as board members. I do a lot of board training. And when I do strategic planning work with nonprofits, I try to at least tie in the financial piece alongside the imaginative piece of strategic planning. I think there's a mistake that many planners make when they go through a nonprofit's portfolio and decide how they're going to move the mission in one direction or another. But I think as long as you're doing that, you should have money in the margin, right? You should have your financial notes in the margin as you're doing that. And keep an eye on that analysis. If you shift the way a nonprofit works, what's that going to do to your revenue? Are you going to have to tell a story all over again? Do you have an audience that's going to abandon you because now all of a sudden you're not doing the thing that they signed on for initially? These things are very important. So, that's why I like to do strategy work. That's why I like to do board training to let them know how to go about doing that.
Well, is that kind of one of the like biggest hurdles that people run into is that like they're not used to financial planning or, leadership meetings or having to build like a story to sell people. They just start this with like goodness in their heart and then like, oh no, what is all this stuff?
Right. Yeah. What do you mean you need to have a donor record, keeping system, a DRM or CRM or whatever they're being referred to as these days? Yeah, software infrastructure is a huge part of business planning for nonprofits. And if you're a board member, you may not have to have your fingers on the keyboard all the time. But I tell people, don't be a board member unless you can be a doer, a door opener, and a donor. And if you can't be those three things, take some time and help find people who can and bring them to the table. Again, gone are the days where you could just show up and vote on a set of minutes and then go home. You have to open up your Rolodex. You have to bring context to the table. You have to play some role in the actual daily machinations of what makes a nonprofit move, which is why being a board member is at least a part-time job.
Certainly. And is there kind of like a typical set of, traps or pitfalls or things people fall into, even, once they're like, we're up and running? I have to imagine there's things where they're like, oh, yeah, you fell into the classic ploy of whatever this is.
Yeah, kind of. The biggest, most glaring one that I've seen is failure to diversify your revenue stream. And if we could point the finger at events again, the classic thing is a nonprofit who all of a sudden does nothing but events fundraising. That's all they do. But then something like COVID comes and then all of your events go away and there goes your stream. But even if you don't rely on just events, I was helping a nonprofit briefly, and the classic fundraising pie should have 3 or 4 slices in it. We want to see more, but the classic at least has 3 or 4 slices in it. One of those slices might be grants. One of those slices might be corporate sponsorships. The third one should be something like individual gifts. And the individual gift slice, we like to see that be the biggest slice because that's the portion of your fundraising effort that goes towards making contact with individual donors, folks who can cut you a $20 check once a year, or maybe in a $50,000 check once a year. Those individual gifts are the biggest bang for the buck from a fundraising agenda, better than events, better than grants. The individual gifts are the way to go. So I was helping this one nonprofit that didn't have 3 or 4 slices in their pie. They had only 2. One huge sliver, if we can call it that, one major overriding arc was corporate gifts. And the tiniest little sliver outside of that arc was individual gifts. And what they had done in 16 years of existence was they had developed these superficial relationships, these unstewarded relationships with corporations around town, who would simply hand over a $2,000 to $5,000 check once a year at the start of every year because that's what they were used to. And I looked at this and I'm like, you realize that those organizations give millions of dollars to other entities with whom they have relationships, with whom they have stewarded relationships. Why aren't we stewarding a relationship with them? Why are you settling for $5,000 a year from this law firm when we could do things that makes that a $10,000 a year gift or more? In any case, so 16 years they operated this way. And then the bubble collapsed. The 2008 recession hit hard. And that entire arc of $2,000 to $5,000 gifts evaporated in the space of a year. And that tiny little sliver of giving that remained was folks who had never even been mailed a letter. And so the nonprofit's looking at me saying, do you think we could do mailing campaigns and keep ourselves floating with mailing asks? And I'm like, no, you can't. And if you're going to survive, you have to fire everybody and subsist on volunteer help, which is exactly what they did. Because doing mailing campaigns for individual gifts is a loss leader for 2 or 3 years before you start making that profitable, typically. Which is why, and I know I'm way off base here now, but which is why diversification of a funding portfolio is critical to avoiding this kind of disaster. If they had taken the time to steward those relationships and make that little piece of the fundraising pie bigger, life would have been much easier for them to mitigate around the time of something like a recession or a pandemic or whatever. So,
yeah. No, I mean, I think you're like right on where my brain is going, because my next thought was, if you have these budgets that can be very inconsistent, say there is like a major recession, your individual donors are probably going to drop, your corporate's definitely going to drop because they're looking to cut any fat they can cut. These things are very inconsistent. How do you like budget for that in a year, or try and like figure out what you're doing?
Yeah, you keep your fingers in it and you keep your eyes on the conditions that may be coming or going. That's why I tell folks that not only should you have an annual budget, you should probably have at least a rough draft 5-year budget. You should have people who are forecasting for your organization, so that some board members might have their fingers on key indicators that the nonprofit should be aware of. Is the economy improving? Is it not improving? Are people going to be needing our services more or less in the next 5 years? Is the climate going to make our ability to get X, Y, and Z products easier or harder. Those kinds of things are important for nonprofits to keep track of, and do some real forecasting on that data that has a direct impact on the way you do your budgeting and your financial planning for the nonprofit.
Well, and much like, any company or investing in stocks or anything like that, like you have to kind of know the market you're in and the forecasting and like speculation. So this seems to very much reinforce the like, you can't just jump in and be like, I have a nonprofit and then hope for the best.
No, yeah, unless you really know how to drive a business proposition with real intent and real manpower behind you, go help a existing nonprofit, help them move the needle because they need your help.
So one of those other slices you had mentioned is grants, which is, for lack of a better term, I guess, free money from the government for very specific things. But that requires like a lot of manpower and writing and planning and stuff as well, doesn't it?
Yes, exactly. People think that grants agendas are easy. They are not. There are reasons why entire consulting firms have people dedicated towards them. So grants require, is it a huge bang for the buck? I don't know, because you still need, I think, a qualified grant writer. You don't want to approach this as an amateur. Asking for corporate grants, from actual philanthropic institutions, you still have to have a relationship with that institution. You can't just apply for your grant and then disappear. You have to learn how to. It's not a game, but it's definitely a maintenance endeavor. You want to keep those people in your orbit somehow creatively. But government grants, people think that they're easy. They're not. There's a huge back-end reporting requirement that come along with government grants that people don't know about. And that back-end reporting has to be done properly. Otherwise, again, you might be putting your tax status in jeopardy by making some mistakes that way. So the grants thing, we could probably spend an entire episode talking about that. But
yeah,
I hope I answered your question.
No, I'm sure we could. It's honestly very deep. And I volunteered with an organization that had like a full-time grant writer. And that person is like, number one, an excellent writer because they know how to request exactly what they need in a very convincing way, but also like a social butterfly because they need to be able to like man those connections forever. If they're like, we can get it this year, next year's not guaranteed unless they love us.
Exactly.
Then it's a little closer towards like, yeah, we'll probably get it.
Exactly. And you're not trying to do anything unethical, right? You're not inviting those grant makers to lunch and you're not promising their kids placement into your college or your program or whatever. But yeah, just creatively figure out how to say hi to them, how to keep them in your orbit, how to not be a stranger. That's the key.
Yeah. Well, and like you said, some people will just apply and then disappear. And it's like, if this is the first time they gave you money and then they don't hear from you all year, like they're not really that incentivized to give you money again. Whereas if you're like, hey, look at all the things we did with your money, they're like, yes. Oh, we know this is a reputable, nonprofit that is actually doing hard work.
Yes, exactly. And then on the other side of that too is the Form 990 at the end of every year, which asks you to explain where your money is coming from and to some degree where it went. So getting grants adds a level of oversight required to fill out your Form 990 at the end of every year, depending on your budget and how big of a grant it was. So there's nothing cavalier about it.
Well, and it seems like, all this money coming in from either individuals or companies or government entities, whatever it is, like there has to be some kind of constant pressure to show good results where you're like, look, we're actually doing something. And that must be like immensely stressful.
It kind of is, and yet it kind of isn't. I've seen people get completely stressed out to an equivalent degree within their for-profit world doing the same thing, right? Like tax season for a lot of my corporate friends is completely nightmarish. You could tell it's wearing on them, and sometimes they don't even get better until May or June. It's like, are you in need of some help? Can I lock you in my dark room for a while so you can recover? Good grief. But yeah, it's just like going back to that part-time job idea. It's not something that you can do without intent, without purpose. It takes some attention to be able to fill out the form properly. And yes, by the way, you're a board member. So by the time you even get to the Form 990, presumably you as a board member have signed off on an annual budget. You have signed off on the actual financial reports that appear in front of you at board meetings. You have signed off on the idea that you've got an accountant who's going to help you with a 990. And then when that accountant comes back with their finished work, you have to sign off on that too. It's not just one person at the table, it's everybody at the table. So is it stressful? Kinda, but it is still real, right? There's no daydream success that's going to happen with the pursuit of a nonprofit cause.
Well, and it seems like, you have all these pieces you need to have where you're like, we have the CEO effective role, we have a board members positions,
Mm-hmm.
we have somebody who is a grant writer, we have somebody at least who is our accountant during tax season. Is there a minimum requirement in this where you're like, if you're starting a nonprofit, you should have 10 people with you? Or can you be like, no, you can run it with 3, but I wouldn't recommend it?
Yeah. No, in fact, I've known people who've done that. I've known people who've started it with 3, and 2 out of the 3 of them are their friends or their family members, which just makes my brain melt for whatever. I don't know why they would do that. But I don't know if there's a best practices suggestion around that for startups. I think, again, if I'm talking to a nonprofit that's been around for a few years and they're looking at issues of board diversification and board makeup, you should think about those things when you're starting up too. Don't just get whoever's available. Find those people who can be aligned with your cause. Find the people who have the skill set you need to make the thing run. And I take that back, who can make the thing crawl, right? Because the nonprofit's going to have to crawl before it can walk, before it can run. So who are those people who are going to take that and bring their time, treasures, and talents to the table so that they can be doers, donors, and door openers? Those are the folks you want from day one. How many of them do you need? I don't know. Is there too many? Yeah, there's probably a point where there's too many. I wouldn't try it with 50, for instance. But I think somewhere in there is the answer. I just don't know how to put numbers on it.
So, I mean, what if we've gotten to that point where we're like, oh, there's 10 people doing the same thing in the same space in a region? Can they like merge like a normal company can, have a merger?
Yes, absolutely. And it works almost the same way as a for-profit merger works. You're talking about a division of assets between 2 companies and how those resources get reallocated into a new bank account with a new financial plan surrounding it. But yes, there's absolutely that can get done. When they do those mergers, they take a look at personnel and decides who stays and who goes, what the new organizational chart will look like, everything like that. Yes.
Well, and that might not be so bad if you're like, hey, we've got 3 of us that are just barely making the cut. If we all come together, like we will probably manage it, even if we have to let a couple people from each company go.
Right. That's right. Which is a sad circumstance to have to look at to some degree, because on the one hand, you've achieved this merger, which arguably might be better for the world, might be better for its stakeholders. On the other hand, you're going to lose personnel when you do that, almost undoubtedly. So that's another reason why you shouldn't start the nonprofit that you're thinking about, because we don't want to put people in that position.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and we've spent so much time talking about like, people doing good work in this field. I am sure just like corporate world, there have been some bad actors throughout the years where it's like, yeah, oh, this nonprofit is the worst people of all time.
No matter where you go, there they are. Yeah, it's weird. I've seen them again. I know they exist. I'm always surprised when I meet them. They're there. But it does take all kinds to make things move. The trick is, at least in my own personal life, I try to steer clear of drama. I have a strict no drama policy. And if I see drama happening, I have to figure out how to put the brakes on it as quickly as possible. And life is short. Why would you allow that to be in a boardroom? Why would you allow that to influence the way you do business? I don't know. People still do it.
And it seems like there's so many levels of accountability in here where you're like, we need to know every salary, every paycheck, everything that came in or out has to be accounted for. How do they manage to get away with like, I don't know, smuggling money out of the company into their own pockets?
Complete mystery to me. I can only imagine it takes a complete lack of scruples and a certain amount of, forgive me, balls, because, you're going to get caught. There's no good way to do it foolproof. And that's when I think rationality no longer has anything to do with it. Something has gone wrong. Someone's going to make a bad decision for which they're going to pay the price. And I've seen it happen. I've seen a nonprofit suffer because of that. Thankfully, the nonprofit did not go under. They didn't steal so much that they suffered. But there are other ways to do it that seem like they're above board. contracts and stuff like that. There are ways to actually give money to people under the guise of having done work, which simply never gets done. It's important to keep an eye out for that kind of thing too.
Well, and that's why there's some level of regulation that says like X% of your income has to go into the thing you're supposed to be giving money to.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And I know that a similar kind of scrutiny is supposed to happen in the corporate world too. But yeah, I think we know how all that goes.
Yeah. Yep. Sometimes people fall through that net. There's a lot of holes
Yeah.
in there.
Yep.
So, I mean, any other like major myths and misconceptions that you're like, I run into these all the time?
No, I think we've hit the major ones. I think again, the major things that I try to hit for folks is the nature of what it means to be a board member, the actual definition of fiduciary responsibility and what it means to the job, the idea that there is no ownership of a nonprofit entity. Those are the major highlights. Just the myth busting I get to do around. What does it mean to run a nonprofit? Does it mean that they're all poor? I'm like, no, it's a tax status. It's not a business model, as my friend David Pauly likes to say. And just stuff like that are the major pieces. The last one, of course, if you're in the mix already, is keep that revenue stream as diversified as possible. And the biggest bang for the buck for fundraising does come from individual asks. And we didn't mention this, Colton, but recurring gifts, people who can just set up a credit card and run a $5 transaction once a month. I don't know why more nonprofits don't take advantage of that capability. It's as close to automating fundraising as anybody can get, and only a fraction of nonprofits will actually do it. So,
yeah. Well, and how many people kind of look at it and they're like, oh, I guess $5 went out again. Whatever, it's not worth the effort for me. Even if I don't want to do it anymore, it's not worth the effort for me to go look at how to cancel it and do all this stuff. Like, right. I'll just give them $5. It's fine.
Right. That's exactly right. The stats, I think, suggest that people who do recurring gifts on their credit cards will at least last as a donor for 6 to 7 years, something like that. But in my mind, it's not even, I hope they forget. In my mind, it's okay. They've aligned themselves with the mission. I have this built-in community now that I can talk to, right? And I don't need to inundate them with mailings. I don't need to send them my annual report, but I can at least send them an email 2 times a year that says, hey, thanks for being a recurring donor. Here's what we've done with your money.
Yeah, it's something much like easier than like we pay a person to write letters, to send letters to you, to pay the mailing, like all of these things that may not make any money back versus just saying like, congratulations, you've maximized your input to the best you can.
Exactly. That's exactly right. I just did a podcast with Elisa Greer, who's a philanthropy coach, among other things. She's just a wonderful, wonderful person. And we were just talking about exactly this. It's like the last thing I want is your very slickly produced annual report that you spent a lot of time making and printing and mailing. Just keep it. I don't want it, because the vast majority of those end up in the garbage anyway. And just things like that. I think practices like that are old school, archaic, and are going to go away. If you have to do an annual report, keep it digital. If you have to send me 14 letters a year, don't, maybe cut it down to 5 and do those digital as well. The world, I think we're looking at a time of transition in the nonprofit world, the way it carries its storytelling forward and the way it stewards ongoing relationships with individuals and their communities.
Yeah, definitely. Well, and it seems like, your advice is like, don't start a nonprofit, like go find one that does the thing you're already talking about. Yeah. And yet I constantly hear like, oh, another person that runs a nonprofit or another nonprofit starting in this sector, whatever it is. Is it like they're becoming more necessary and so we're seeing more of them? Or are people just like, they figured out how easy it is to start one and now they want like the recognition to be like, yeah, I had a nonprofit?
Yeah, I honestly don't know how to answer that question. Are they simply doing it because they want to do it? Have they identified a business need and they're trying to fill it, right? Like, did they do the research and their business planning says, yes, move forward? I hope so. But whatever the case, and I know this doesn't answer your question, but whichever path they took to get there, if your listeners are thinking about doing a nonprofit of any kind, go spend at least 1 term as a board member at an existing organization and be a stellar board member. Don't just show up and vote on the minutes. Do for them the kind of things that you would do for your own nonprofit as you're writing your own business plan, right? And I think that's the best way to get the 5-mile view for everything that you have to do to get your own nonprofit up and off the ground. So, make board service part of your research as you're thinking about starting your own nonprofit.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, this is just experience. Like, you're earning experience in the field before you jump into it. Like, you don't want to start a business at 16 and pour all of your assets into it and then be like, oh, hey, I don't know how businesses work.
Right.
Like, oh no, I've been an employee. I know what that means. I've done some research. I know how businesses operate. Like, this is just that version of it for a nonprofit.
Exactly.
No.
What do you mean I have to pay human resources taxes? Right.
No, I think that's great. It's just one of those that I've seen where I'm like, oh, I see the term nonprofit a lot more. I don't know if it's just getting more publicity or if it's like there's some major failure in our country that is demanding we have more nonprofits. And that's hard.
It is hard. And I don't know what the current statistics look like in terms of the overall number of nonprofits. I thank you for that inspiration. I'm going to go dig that up and see what I can find.
Always happy to provide dumb questions.
Love it.
Well, Mickey, I have appreciated your time immensely. This has been super fun. I'd love to have you back for even more stuff, but make sure people can find you if they're looking to find more from you.
Sure, absolutely. If folks want to know about nonprofit stuff, you can find me via two websites. One of them is the nonprofitsnapshot.org. That's the thing I'm appifying. And then the nonprofitsnapcast.org is the podcast. Failing that, LinkedIn. I think I'm one of the only Mickey Desais in Atlanta, Georgia on LinkedIn. And it works generally as well as email. So people can definitely go find me up on LinkedIn. I always appreciate getting contacts there. And yes, Colton, thank you for having me as a guest today. I thoroughly enjoyed this. Let's definitely do it again. Just say when.
Yeah, absolutely. And if people, you go find the snapshot or you find the Snapcast, both of those links will be in the show notes. So you can just drop down and find them very easily. If you listen to something like the Nonprofit Snapcast, leave a comment, leave a review, subscribe, do something that helps other people find it because you found, good use in it. So I always tell people, like, please go help your creators like that. So Mickey, again, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Colton. Hope the rest of your weekend goes fantastically.
It seems so unusual that a board member of a potentially large company cannot be paid, but I feel like it has to be that way in order to keep any honesty in the system. Let me know what you think. In other news, July is rolling onwards, and the rankings have updated a little. Number 1, the United States, still led by New York, Texas, and Oregon. Number 2, England of the United Kingdom, taking back the number 2 spot. Number 3, Canada, with British Columbia closing in on the throne-holding Ontario. Number 4, Australia, with New South Wales holding a lead and Victoria bumping the country up a spot. And number 5, Ghana, carefully holding a lead over New Zealand. Remember, you can still get those Magic Mind deals by going to magicmind.com/justdumb20 or entering the code justdumb20 for up to 48% off. That's it for this week. Have a great week, a great weekend, and I'll see you all back here next week for another new episode. Until that next episode, pretty please do all those things that help the show grow, like rating, reviewing, liking, and subscribing. Remember, you can also reach out to dumbenoughpodcast@gmail.com or on any of the social media pages if you want to reach me personally. But most importantly, stay dumb.